featuring 3 women hidden in plain sight and awakened by 3 21st century female writer-readers who are contributing their insights to the diverse layers and aspects of a variety of women. Here is Cece Sloan.
Before the pandemic, I developed a program called Mind Reels, documentary films about notable women, and voices of exciting women writers and poets, which was not on film, but written and presented by women in our community. With the pandemic, I began to think again about reviving the glory of women in history, so as not to render them gone and forgotten. So here we are, reclaiming them in a postmodern fashion and presented to you through the Zoom. Thank you, and hope you will join us again in October, the date to be determined.
Thank you. Today's readers are Lucy V. Parker, bringing to light Olympe de Gouges, French revolutionary playwright, and born 1748. Sloan Robinson will be bringing us Josephine Baker, American-born French dancer, singer, and activist, born 1906. Gouges Allen will introduce us to Ruth Prawer Jhabvala, Academy Award-winning screenwriter, novelist, and short story writer, born 1927. So, ladies, here is Lucy Parker.
Thank you, Estelle. As Cece just told you, reclaiming women in modern history, women hidden in plain sight, is not a new activity for her. That is, if you can stretch your definition of modern history to include the French Revolution. Actually, it was in 2009, 11 years ago, that Cece suggested I look into a nearly forgotten figure, the late 18th century French playwright, Olympe de Gouges. What came out of that was my writing and Cece producing a short one-person biodrama featuring Tony Redman as Olympe and Carol Shallon as the narrator. Here's Tony. Here's Carol. But what I remember most about that whole time was that during rehearsals, Tony told us that she had begun dreaming about Olympe. Now, I had unfolded the story chronologically, but suddenly Tony, not a writer, produced a new and better opening in which Olympe awaits an appointment she does not want to keep, an appointment with a guillotine. It was as though the playwright had returned to tell Tony, fix that script. So there you have it. Spoiler alert, the activist died for her beliefs. And here's a contemporary drawing of Olympe at the guillotine. Olympe de Gouges was a remarkable woman. Born in 1748 in southern France, she was more or less openly acknowledged as the illegitimate daughter of a literary nobleman in the town. As such, she believed herself to be destined to rise above her petty bourgeois origins, and she did. She was gifted with stunning self-confidence, due perhaps to her loving care provided by her mother and her legal father, as well as her natural father, who played a big part in her life until she was 9 and then vanished. Her confidence spelled survival as an adult. Having been unhappily married at 17, she vowed never to marry again after her husband's early death. She dropped her married name and changed her maiden name, which was Marie Gouges, to Olympe de Gouges, this was a combination of her mother's middle name and an alternate spelling of Gouges. So she soon left her old life behind. At 20, in 1767, she moved to Paris with her son at the invitation of a wealthy military transport entrepreneur. Her regional speech was against her as she worked to master Parisian French, but she was not afraid to flout convention. Here's you don't see this picture that often, but a a painting of Olympe looking very self-confident, I think, with that wonderful hat. She was well provided for by her lover and threw herself into Parisian life. She gained social access and patronage through her wit and charm, and it was rumored, through more liaisons with successful men. Some wanted to marry her, but she declined, declaring marriage to be, quote, the tomb of trust and love. And that's one of Olympe's most famous quotes. Thus, in spite of a limited education and ignoring the mocking criticism that dogged her, Olympe de Gouges became a successful playwright and one of the first modern feminists, mixing with the elite of Paris in salons where the Enlightenment was in full swing. Her major claim to fame was inspired by the Declaration of the Rights of Men and the Citizen, very famous document and considered the formative text of the French Revolution, and it conspicuously omitted women. It was approved by the French Assembly in 1789, and in outraged response, encouraged by her friends, Olympe wrote and published her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen in 1791. "Woman, wake up," she commanded. "The tocsin of reason is being heard throughout the whole universe. Discover your rights. The powerful empire of nature is no longer surrounded by prejudice, fanaticism, superstition, and lies. Enslaved man has multiplied his strength and needs recourse to yours to break his chains. Having become free, he has become unjust to his companion. Oh, women, women, when will you cease to be blind?" But feminism was not Olympe's only cause. The Israeli magazine Haaretz observed in 2017, the ideas she espoused, including income tax and tax on capital, full equality between blacks and whites, a solidly entrenched public health system, welfare services for the needy, and of course, the right of women to vote and take part in political life, were realized in time and became pillars of modern Western society. I might add that the rights of illegitimate children were another of Olympe's concerns, and that was a cause she had personal experience with. This is the most familiar painting of Olympe. This was the gal who had all those ideas. And of course, she's also remembered as a playwright. A British website, olympedegouges.eu, includes English translations of the full texts of her plays. A really wonderful asset for scholars, including her controversial anti-slavery drama, about which one commentator wrote, quote, "Death threats resulted from one of her earliest plays, The Lucky Shipwreck, about the terrors of slavery and the slave trade. She narrowly escaped being locked up in the Bastille." Olympe participated in organizations such as the Friends of Blacks. She was a prolific pamphleteer and poster writer. She was also a fierce mother. She looked out for the future of her son, Pierre Aubrey de Gouges, and was relieved at last to see him married with a successful military career. Historian Olivier Blanc, who has devoted more than 30 years to studying de Gouges, writes, quote, "She was said to have been a type of prostitute, that it was impossible to rely on her as a reference in the struggle for women's liberation. But that was a trap. People knew very well that if the memory of her was preserved, the campaign for women's lib would gain momentum." Blanc also points out, de Gouges was among the first to grasp that Robespierre was a dangerous person, that he was a demagogue who talked about democracy but actually aimed at personal power and dictatorship, and history proved she was right. He concludes, "She was one of the first women who entered political life. She was a model for other women, and for that, she also paid with her life." Being investigated before her trial, Olympe withheld none of her writings, but characteristically, during her trial, she lied, insisting that she was 38 and pregnant, while she was in fact 45, and her claim of pregnancy failed to delay her execution. Historical footnote here, pregnancy did save a few women, as 370 females went to the guillotine. The first and most famous, of course, was Marie Antoinette, killed in 1793 to help destroy the Bourbon dynasty. And just 2 weeks later, Olympe was the second victim, killed for ideas which her detractors hoped to bury her with. They nearly succeeded. For 2 centuries, history has dealt with Olympe de Gouges unfairly when at all. A biography in 1900 described her as arrogant, sly, pampered, brazen, licentious, greedy, wicked, and crazy. But what led to her being seen as a pariah? For one thing, throughout the 19th and much of the 20th centuries, Olympe's views remained ahead of their time. Bear in mind that French women first got the vote in 1944. And as we've mentioned, many observers disapproved of her lifestyle. Further, the French have been slow to forgive Olympe for seeking to restore the monarchy when she saw the democratic revolution in which she had so passionately believed turn horribly wrong. Today, however, new articles, books, and websites extol Olympe's accomplishments. One site even calls its potpourri of news on women's rights degougerie. Yet surprisingly, neither TV nor film seems so far to have done her justice. Maybe a role for Scarlett Johansson or Nicole Kidman. In Olympe's home of Montauban, a theater is named after her. While worldwide, fans purchase Olympe t-shirts and art. True, in 2014, she was denied a spot in the Pantheon beside such luminaries as Marie Curie. But in 2016, a marble bust of Olympe was installed in the French National Assembly. And this year, in 2020, France put her on a postage stamp. So the legend grows. I was lucky in my previous Olympe research to discover this slim volume titled Women's Rights in the French Revolution, a biography of Olympe de Gouges by Sophie Musset, a French journalist and photographer. Believe it or not, this is the first book-length biography of Olympe, and it was published in 2003, which was 210 years after her death. Reviewer John Taylor said of the book, often dismissed as a coquettish socialite and mere agitator, the tall, beautiful, and witty Olympe de Gouges was in fact a pioneering social thinker, an uncompromising, engaging playwright, a far-seeing feminist. Olympe de Gouges developed a deep, probing moral and political conscience before she, herself a revolutionary, fell victim to the same revolutionary excesses that she perceived, defined, and denounced. Sadly, 12 days after her death, her son signed an official document in which he dissociated himself from his mother in order to save his military career and possibly his life. This monster, I deny that she was my mother. She was not a Republican, Pierre wrote. But later he worked to restore his mother's reputation. Let me end with 2 passages from our 2010 biodrama, quotes from her writing to maybe help explain Olympe. And I wish Tony were here to read these, but she did a wonderful job. Describing the results of her activism, Olympe recounts this incident. And here you'll see what a wonderful sense of humor she had. Last year, I was physically assaulted by a mob at the door of my home. In spite of their insults, I confronted them until someone grabbed me by the hair and offered to auction off my head. 24 and change for Madame de Gouges' head, he yelled. My friend, I shouted back, I'll give you 30 for it if you choose me over your other bidders. The crowd began to laugh and let me go. And about her writing process, Olympe explains, I claim originality, which probably can't be denied as I owe it to my ignorance. I even like to flaunt it. I owe nothing to the knowledge of men. I am a student of nature. I never correct my writing. I am my work. And when I create, there is only ink, paper, and quills on my desk. I've quite often had secretaries who multiply mistakes instead of correcting them, and I've often made mistakes myself. I won't deny it. I only get on well with truly honest people. I abhor false men, despise evil ones, flee from rogues, drive away flatterers. One could judge from that I'm often alone. Well, I never bore myself. So that was Alone.
Thank you, Lucy, for that wonderful presentation. And now we'll hear from Sloan Robinson telling us about Josephine Baker.
Well, hello, good morning. I'm so happy and honored to be here to have an opportunity to talk about my muse, Josephine Baker. I'm in my Josephine Baker corner. This is a beautiful Josephine Baker doll that was made for me for one of my shows that was presented to me. You know, Josephine loved her feathers. And then these are the bananas from my banana dance when I do my show. It's called Bananas, A Day in the Life of Josephine Baker. If you want more information about it, Google it. So, Frida Josephine McDonald Baker, international star, civil rights activist, humanitarian. June 3rd, 1906 to April 12th, 1975. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, little Josephine dreamed of being a vaudeville performer. Her mother was a washerwoman, took in laundry, and Josephine helped. Josephine never knew her white father. Now, they lived in a place called Boxcar Town in East St. Louis. It was an area for coloreds. It was a jungle of old boxcars the railroad no longer used. Now, Josephine loved to dance, knowing all the latest steps. It was a poor but a happy childhood until the St. Louis Massacre of 1917. Boxcar Town was set on fire by white men paid to burn everything to the ground. Josephine was only 11 years old. She witnessed the fire, the burning, the people running out of their boxcars to escape the flames, the screaming, the burning bodies. Now, her career began by chance. After the fire, she and her mother moved to another poor section of town, continued to take in wash, and Josephine struggled to regain her happy spirit. Now, one day, her mother sent her to the store, and on the way, Josephine had to pass by the Booker T. Washington Theater. She looked up on the marquee, and Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, was the star of the show. Now, she knew her mother would be upset, but taking the quarter given to her to buy fatback and greens, she gave it to the ticket lady and ran inside. Sitting on the front row, she watched every show until night fell. Then the curtain went down. Josephine couldn't leave. She found her way backstage and ran right into Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues. Her satin gown was covered with ketchup, grease, and spilled gin. She was a mess, weaving back and forth, hollering, cussing about how her no-good dresser never being around when she needed her. Well, little Josephine told Bessie Smith that she could get all those stains out, that she and her mother took in wash, and that it was easy for her. They did good laundry for the white folks in East St. Louis. The Empress told her, girl, if you can get this stuff off this dress, I'll give you $1. $1? Her and her mother washed tons of loads and washing and drying, ironing. They only got $2 for all that work. So $1 was big. She did such a good job that Bessie offered her a job as her dresser. And they were leaving St. Louis that night. It paid $10 a week and train fare. She took it. Now, at 12 years old, she was on the road with the Empress of the Blues, sat in the wings of the theaters and learned everything she could about performing, and married her first of 4 husbands. Josephine was a natural entertainer. It didn't take long for Bessie to put her in the show. A few years later, vaudeville was dying out, so Josephine left the show, lied about her age, and became a Cotton Club chorus girl. Then she went on to do many other shows like Shuffle Along, Mbamville, Les Revue Neg, a review of Negroes, and other shows. Now that show, La Revue Neg, took her to Paris in 1925. It didn't go over very well with the Parisians. It had a lot of tap dancing in it. But Josephine did. She could really dance and had this amazing long tan body. The great Ziegfeld saw her in that show and put her in his Folies Bergère. Now, Ziegfeld created a specialty act just for Josephine. Set in a jungle, she danced bare-breasted with only a string of bananas around her waist. The infamous banana dance. And this is a postcard of Josephine in the banana dance outfit. And this is a beautiful rendering of her done by an artist of also the banana dance. The Parisians had never seen anything like Josephine Baker. She became an overnight sensation. She was 20 years old. They called her the Bronze Venus, the Black Sally Rand, our Charleston Queen. She was labeled the fashionista. All the famous fashion houses clamored to dress her in their designs. Dior, Worth, Chanel. She was so famous and popular for her beautiful gowns that they even created a paper doll of Josephine. Remember paper dolls? Some of you out there, where you cut out the outfits and put it on the paper doll? And this one is from the Folies Bergère. She always wore elaborate, fabulous costumes because she wore them so well. Famous artists like Picasso and Paul Cézanne painted images of her. She was the most photographed woman in the world. And there were photographs like these, very dramatic. Like you can't even picture anybody doing something like this but Josephine Baker. And even as she became a mature woman, she always had the wigs, the gowns, the everything. And she was famous for that ponytail. And here's another picture of that ponytail. That ponytail was so well known for her that when I did my show, went to a salon and had that wig made so I could wear it in the show. Fabulous. Just fabulous. Now, and Paul Cézanne, I must show you this. Paul Cézanne did a whole sketchbook, all the sketches inspired by the fabulous Josephine. Let's see, there. Oh, aren't they beautiful? Okay, now, she also made 3 movies, Siren of the Tropics, Zuzu, and Princess Tam Tam, at a time where there were no Black leading ladies in feature films. And she also had a recording contract. And after a show one day, a night, a fan gave me the album. I believe it's a 78. So Josephine Baker became the first international Black star, singer, dancer, actor, what we call in the business a triple threat. Then came World War II. Josephine did not flee back to her homeland, America. Instead, she became a Red Cross nurse. She could have easily gone back to America, but she wanted to fight for the French people, the people that she loved, her second home. Now, after she became a Red Cross nurse, she was recruited into the French resistance and became a spy. With international stardom, you see, she could cross borders carrying microfilm in her wigs. Secret messages written in invisible ink was on her sheet music, and secret documents were sewn deep into the linings of her costumes. When Josephine was found out by the Nazis, she was poisoned. The resistance managed to smuggle her to Morocco, where she eventually recovered. The world thought Josephine Baker was dead. The poisoning had left her unable to have children. This was devastating. Josephine wanted to have children. Now, in 1942, the American soldiers landed in Casablanca. A lieutenant heard that Josephine was there, found out, and found her and asked her to sing for the troops. The American army was still segregated. Josephine took the opportunity to speak out. She told the soldiers that they were brothers fighting the same war, that the American army must show the world that the blacks and the whites were treated equally in the American army. All the white soldiers sat in the front. All the colored ones sat in the back. Josephine told them she would not be able to sing for them until they sat side by side. They did. And she sang for them. She sang her signature song, J'ai deux amours. I have two loves, my country and my beloved Paris. And it goes something like this. J'ai deux amours, mon pays est Paris. Parle toujours, mon corps est ravi. Ma servante est belle, mes écouets bon lignés. Ce que mon son c'est le c'est Paris, Paris, tu hantais. Les voix en jour, c'est bon rêve joli. J'ai deux amours, mon pays et Paris. Now, Josephine was awarded their highest French military medal by President Charles de Gaulle for her work in World War II. She was a war hero. Now, the war was over, and Josephine was married to her fourth and last husband, Jacques Bouillon, who was also her band leader. They toured the world. Josephine saw many orphans around the world, and she decided to adopt a child, then another, then another, then another. Now, Joe had agreed to 4 children. Well, Josephine adopted 12. 10 boys and 2 girls, all from different countries. You see, Josephine believed in the universal family and wanted to show the world that racial harmony could be achieved. She and Joe built their world village. It was the Chateau Les Moulins, beautiful chateau that you can actually go and visit now. Go to Paris and you can go to Les Moulins in Dordogne in the south of France. The children were raised in the language and the faith of their birth, while Josephine traveled the world performing to support their world village. And it took a lot of support because it was like a little city. It had a hotel, a restaurant, a theater, the Josephine Baker Museum. It had stables, cows, chickens, peacocks, all for the tourists to come and see how she and her children lived together with no racism. And for the rest of her days, she worked to support her children and to speak out against racial inequality. Josephine fought the good fight. But the one thing that Josephine wanted most in her life was accomplished in less than a day. It actually took less than 20 minutes on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. It was at the Civil Rights March led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Josephine was honored to be his guest, to march alongside Dr. King. You see, she was no longer an American citizen. Her passport had been taken away. But she had recently been admitted to the United States through the efforts of President John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert, the Attorney General, and Dr. King. There were more than 50,000 people in attendance, which was a lot of people in those days. It had been a dreary day, but now the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Dr. King was introducing the guests on the platform, then he came to Josephine, and as she rose, a great roar swelled up from the crowd. It seemed the cheers and applause would never stop. She sat back down. Then someone shouted, "Stand up, Josephine, and tell it like it is." She had no intention of speaking to the people that day. She was not prepared. Dr. King gave her a nod, and Josephine stepped to the podium, and this is an edited version of her speech. Friends and family, you know, I have lived a long time, and I have come a long way. And you must know now that what I did, I originally did for myself. Then later, as these things began happening to me, I wondered if they were happening to you. And I knew there must be. And I know you had no way to defend yourselves as I had. And as I continued to do the things that I did and to say the things that I said, they began to beat me. Not beat me with a club, but you know I have seen that done too. They beat me with their pens, with their writings, and friends, that is much worse. You see, when I was a child, they burned me out of my home. I was frightened and I ran away. It was to a place called France. Ladies and gentlemen, in that country, I never feared. It was like a fairyland place. When I left St. Louis a long, long time ago, the conductor directed me to the last car. And you know what that means. But when I ran away, yes, when I ran away to another country, I didn't have to do that. I could go to any restaurant I wanted to. I could drink water any place I wanted to, and I didn't have to go to a colored toilet. And I have to tell you, it was nice. And I got used to it. And I liked it. And I wasn't afraid anymore that someone would shout at me and say, go to the end of the line. So over there, far away, I was happy. And because I was happy, I had some success. And you know that too. Then after a long time, I came back to America to be in a great show for Mr. Ziegfeld. And you know Josephine was happy. You know that because I wanted to tell everyone in my country about myself. I wanted to let everyone know that I made good. And you know that that is only natural. But on that great ship, I had a bad experience. A very important star was to sit with me at dinner. And at the last moment, I learned she didn't want to eat with a colored woman. I can tell you, it was some blow. And when I got back to New York, way back then, I had other blows. When they would not let me check into the good hotels I was accustomed to because I was colored. Or eat in certain restaurants. And you know, friends, I do not lie to tell you that I have walked into the palaces of kings and queens and into the houses of presidents and much, much more. But I could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee. And that made me mad. And you know when I get mad, you know I open my big mouth. And then look out, because when Josephine opens her mouth, they hear it all over the world. So I did open my mouth. And you know I did scream. And when I demanded what I was supposed to have and what I was entitled to, they would not give it to me. So then they thought they could smear me. And the best way to do that was to call me a communist. And you know too what that meant. Those were dreaded words in those days. And I want to tell you also that I was hounded by the American agencies in America, and they never found 1 ounce of proof I was a communist. But they were mad. They were mad because I told the truth. Friends and brothers and sisters, that is how it went. And when I screamed loud enough, they started to open the door just a little bit. And we all started to be able to squeeze through it. Not just the colored people, but other minorities too. I am not a young woman now, friends. My life is behind me. There's not too much fire burning inside me. And now, before it goes out, I want you to use what is left to light that fire in you so that you carry on and that you can do these things that I have done. Then when my fires have burned out and we all go where we go someday, I can be happy You know, I have always taken the rocky path. I never took the easy one because as I grew older and I knew I had the power and the strength, I took that rocky road, that rocky path, and I tried to smooth it out a little. I wanted to make it easier for you. I want you to have a chance at what I had, but I do not want you to have to run away to get it. And mothers and fathers, if it is too late for you, think of your children. Make it safe here so they do not have to run away. Ladies and gentlemen, my friends and family, I thank you. And may God bless you. And may He continue to bless you long after I am gone. Well, Josephine Baker was the only woman that was asked to speak that day. And that was the speech she gave with no preparation. So to Josephine, that standing ovation was the greatest she's ever received, and she received plenty because it was from her people, the American people. Now, La Baker, she lives through me, podcasts, websites, blogs, and many remaining fans, along with publications, books like this one, Jazz Age Josephine, written for the young people so they can learn about the amazing Josephine Baker. Oh, and lastly, she even has a stamp. Let me see if I can get in there. A Josephine Baker stamp, a part of the Black Cinema series. So, thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about Josephine La Baker.
Oh, thank you, Sloan, for that wonderful, lively presentation. Let's hear from Gila Allen to tell us about Ruth Prawer Jhabvala.
I don't know about you, but back in the days when Miramax and Merchant Ivory was synonymous with independent films, I was a film junkie. I tried to see most of the movies that came out each year, and especially those nominated for the Academy Awards. And of course, the game was to guess who would win in each category. And for about 10 years, I received DVDs of tons of movies each year as a voting member of SAG. I always loved movies, at least until they seemed limited to comic book blockbusters, horror films, and cult comedies. Now, if I manage to see 3 or 4 movies a year, that's a lot. New movies, that is. I relegate myself to TCM and the British TV programs I get on PBS. Anyway, back to Merchant Ivory. That is Ismail Merchant, producer, James Ivory, director, and Ruth Prawer Jhabvala, writer. 44 films were produced by Merchant Ivory, and Jhabvala wrote or adapted 23 of them. Of this collaboration, Merchant once commented, "It is a strange marriage we have at Merchant Ivory. I am an Indian Muslim, Ruth is a German Jew, and Jim is a Protestant American. Someone once described us as a three-headed god. Maybe they should have called us a three-headed monster." So, Ruth Prawer Jhabvala was a German Jew. Her father, Marcus Prawer, a lawyer, was born in Poland and emigrated after World War I to Cologne, Germany, where he met his wife, Eleanor Cohen, and their son, Sigbert, was born in 1925. Their daughter, Ruth, 2 years later, in 1927. 6 years before the rise of Hitler. The family lived the colorful life of assimilated Jewry, prevalent in Germany at that time. They were well off, educated, and cultured, as were the people they hung around with, the middle class, the bourgeoisie of Cologne. When Ruth was just 6, she was asked to write a composition in school about a rabbit. Of this experience, she said, "I wrote the title, der Hase, and at once I was flooded with my destiny. Only I didn't know that's what it was. I only remember my entire absorption, delight in writing about, giving my impression of der Hase. To think that such happiness could be. After that, she wrote incessantly. In her teens, she filled drawers and closets with unfinished novels, plays, and stories. But at the same time as she was discovering her early love of writing, the world was about to change. The same year, Ruth composed her first short story, The Rabbit, was the year Hitler came to power. She walked to school amid taunts of Jude, Jude, and had things thrown at her. Germany, no, all of Europe was about to experience the mindless atrocities of an egomaniacal dictator with no scruples whatsoever. I won't mention another, never mind. In 1934, Ruth's father wanted to emigrate to Palestine, but her mother resisted. She was sure that conditions in Germany would improve. She was wrong. So they stayed in Cologne until 1939, when it was almost impossible to remain alive under the Nazis. In fact, the Prawers were one of the last Jewish families to escape to England before the Anschluss, the onslaught. Ruth was 12 years old. They lost at least 40 relatives in the Holocaust and many friends. In her own words, my father's entire family, part of my mother's family, the children I went to school with, and most of my parents' friends, in fact, our entire social circle. In 1948, when Ruth was 19 years old, her distraught father committed suicide. She seldom wrote or spoke of this or of her childhood, but in a rare public lecture she gave in 1979, she said of those years, "They should have been my most formative years." And maybe they were, I don't know. Together with the early, happy German Jewish bourgeois family years, they should be that profound well of memory and experience from which, as a writer, I should have drawn. I never have. I don't know why not. I do know that they were the beginning of my disinheritance, the way they offer other writers of their inheritance. Ruth was a student of English literature at Queen's Mary College, London. Her MA thesis was on the short story in England. By this time, of course, English was her lingua franca, her primary language, and indeed the short story was the primary form she followed and would excel at. In fact, many of her 25 published books were compilations of short stories. In 1949, when Ruth was 22 and in college, she attended a party and met Cyrus Jhabvala, an Indian Parsi architect who had come to England to study. Within a year, they were engaged, and he returned to India to find a position and settle himself financially. 2 years later, having acquired a good job, he returned to England, and in 1951, he and Ruth were married and left England to live in India. She and Cyrus went on to have 3 daughters and had a very warm and happy marriage. As for Ruth's first impressions of India, it was a revelation. From post-war austere Britain, where living was pretty basic and grim and gray, she found herself transported to a, quote, grand fairyland full of sights and sounds and colors. There were exotic flowers, birds, and smells, captivating music performed by female vocalists who, for me, were somehow an expression of everything a woman artist does. She was also captivated by the food, especially the sweets that she consumed by the pound, and which she called the essence of all sweetness that there ever could be. In 1955, she published her first novel. Clearly influenced by Indian culture, it told the story of two young people who fall in love while their families engage in matching them up with very different prospects. By 1963, other novels followed, all equally influenced by Indian culture. In early 1962, just prior to the release of her fifth book, a 33-year-old budding director named James Ivory and a 25-year-old budding producer, Ismail Merchant, approached her in Delhi. They were hoping to adapt her fourth novel, The Householder, a social satire of contemporary Delhi, and asked if she would help them turn it into a film. Ruth did not imagine herself to be a budding screenwriter, so when they first telephoned her, she pretended to be her mother-in-law to put them off. But they persisted and called at her home. I told them I've never done anything like this before, but they said, "It doesn't matter, we haven't either." The film, made from her screenplay and based on her book, opened the following year and was the first feature for all three, but far from the last. The movie that followed in 1965 was an original screenplay, Shakespeare-Wala, which she co-wrote with James Ivory, and it featured Shashi Kapoor and Madhur Jaffrey, the then wife of our dear friend Saeed Jaffrey. The movie follows a British family's acting company as it tours India performing Shakespeare to ever smaller audiences. Early in the film, the troupe meets a monkey trainer who sorrowfully explains that people no longer care for his art. "Our story exactly," says one of the actors. Their next film, The Guru, featured our friend Saeed Jaffrey, and both he and Madhur each appeared in two other Merchant Ivory films. Through the 60s and until she left India in 1975, Ruth's books and the movies she wrote for Merchant Ivory depicted life in post-colonial India, often with a wry sense of satirical humor, always with an eye towards the truth. She wrote about middle-class Indian households, shy newlyweds and demanding mothers-in-law, pompous heads of family, irresponsible sons, and snooping aunties. In the opening stories of her collection, entitled At the End of the Century, Jhabvala sketches character and plot in just a few words. In a story, for instance, about two rivalrous brothers, the elder with his silk suit, his big ring, his oiled and scented hair, and the younger, puny and insignificant, a shop attendant with just the right mixture of dignity and obsequiousness. She paints a picture of India which mixes old traditions with the British influence that the middle class labors under. She is unsparing about the constraints and the tedium of women's lives, and also about the women who are leading them. Jhabvala moves steadily from her earlier feeling of enchantment with India to a sense of distaste for a country where she felt everything Indian abominable. She could no longer shake an awareness that the most salient fact about India is that it is very poor and very backward. She shuts the blinds, cranks up the air conditioning, and buries herself in literature in an effort to avoid the deprivation around her. But all the time, I know myself to be on the back of this great animal of poverty and backwardness, she said. Among the many awards she received for both her books and screenplays was the Booker Prize, which she received in 1975 for her novel Heat and Dust. That very same year, when she was 48 years old, Ruth took the prize money she had received and emigrated, some might say escaped, to America, New York's Upper East Side to be exact, where she bought an apartment in the same building as Merchant and Ivory. Her husband, Cyrus, whom she called Jab, remained for the most part in Delhi, where he continued his architectural work. Ruth spent most winters there with him, but Jab visited New York regularly, and when he retired, he left India and moved permanently to New York. So, New York. The city was, for Ruth, a resurrection of her youth. A cultural mecca she described as the most European place on earth I know. She had no desire to visit Germany. Everything good she remembered about it, she now had in New York. From jars of pickled cucumber to the ballet and concerts, she could not have asked for anything more. And in New York, she stayed until she died in 2013 at the age of 86. 38 years that made up for her disinheritance, her lost youth in Germany. During that time, she wrote the most memorable of the Merchant Ivory movies, The Europeans, based on Henry James' novel, A Room with a View, Howard's End, The Remains of the Day, among others. 19 movies in all, for which she won 2 Academy Awards, for Howard's End and A Room with a View, and many other awards and nominations. Somehow, she also managed to fit in 3 more books of short stories and 8 other works of fiction. I don't know where she found the time to write the short stories and novels and screenplays that she did. It's true that many of the screenplays were adaptations of either her own work or well-known novelists of the time, but I know how long it can take to write even an adaptation. She must have had a full-time nanny raising her 3 daughters during her early writing years, though I couldn't find that information anywhere. Between her birth in 1927 and her death in 2013, Ruth Prawer Jhabvala authored 25 books, many of them compilations of short stories, and scripted 25 movies, and I saw most of them.
Thank you so much, Gila. We heard you, and it was a great presentation. So that ends our program for the day. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Lucy, Sloan, and Gila. I don't know if Cece has any final comments.
I totally appreciate the 3 readers today and their writing. You all were amazing, and somehow you fit the character or the woman that I asked you to write about. So I hope you'll all come back. I see plenty of dear friends on here and some new people as well, and thank you.
Thanks, Joan.
Thank you all.